Okay, so we have our code. Our code is essentially the same as what we had on Tuesday, but I made a change. I changed this from all lowercase to all uppercase, that worst. What I want to do is I want to first set it up so that I can build and deploy it. Okay, and the way we build our script is we package all of our source code files as a zip file. What I want to do is I want to change that. I want to change that so that I create a script that's going to do that for me. Okay, so I'm going to add a new file. My script is going to be just build matc demo.sh. Okay, so I know that I have to zip up all of the files. I want to do it recursively. I want my output to be matc demo.zip, so it overwrites that existing file if it exists. And I want all of the files in my current directory. Okay, so that's the first command that I want to issue. That's going to build the zip file. We already saw that from the command line. So if I take this command and move it over to my terminal, you'll see that it executes fine. So if I issue that command, and I'm in the wrong location right now, so I need to be in that matc demo folder. I actually have it up over here. If I issue that command, that zip recursively, it grabs all the files, and eventually what ends up happening is if I'm looking on the file system, you'll see this zip file just got modified at 1240, so right now. So it got replaced. The next step I need to do is I need to upload that file out to AWS Lambda, right? So the next step that we had done in the past was we'd come out to AWS Lambda and we'd say, look, we want to change this source code. We want to upload that zip file that has our source code file changes so that those changes can be reflected and we can save it. Instead, what I want to do is I want to do that using the AWS CLI. Okay, so the way I'm going to do that with the AWS CLI is there's a command AWS Lambda update function code. I have to give it a function name. So what function am I updating? I'm updating this matc hello world. I can kind of see it in my background. I know it's hard to see on the projected screen, but the function name is my Lambda function name, whatever I called it in Lambda. That's what I called it in Lambda. Okay, so I have this matc hello world, and then I have to specify what file am I updating it with. So what's the zip file that I'm updating it with? In the zip file, I specify the file. Zip files are binary files, so I have to specify that it's a binary file. That's what this file B is indicating. And that's just going to have me give a file path to the updated matc demo.zip. That's the zip file that I created. So file B : / and then the path to that zip file that I want to push out to AWS Lambda. Okay, so if I enter this, it takes a second. But eventually I see that it was updated, so it says it was successful. Okay, and if you remember, let's go back over to Lambda. We saw the success. The worst team is the Cubs. You saw worst is all lowercase. I'm ready to test this again because I pushed out my code. So I'm ready to test it again. And now you'll see that I have the uppercase version of it. So I know that this terminal script was successful. I'm going to take this terminal script and I'm going to move it into my build script. So I zip the files, and then I'm going to push them out to AWS Lambda. It's a two-part command, right? Zip up the files that I want to go out to Lambda, and then push that zipped file, that binary zipped file, out to Lambda so that I have the updated source code. So now whenever I want this to happen, so if I want to say, like, the worst team is, right? So I save that. And I want to push this out to AWS Lambda. All I'm going to do is, there's now a file that I have named over here, which is build matc demo.sh. .sh is the file extension for a shell script. So all I'm going to say is build matc. I don't know why it's not auto-completing. So /build matc demo.sh. Permissions denied. I don't have execute permission on that file, and I need execute permission. This is a Linux permissions issue, so basically it's saying either change the permission so that that executable script can run, or run it as an administrator. Okay, so right now, I don't have access to execute that file. I'm going to change it so that I do. So don't worry about this. This is not a Windows thing, but I'm going to chmod 777 build. And now if I run that same command, now you'll notice it ran and it updated. So it built all of those zip files and then it pushed it out to Lambda. That's my build process now. Now if I test this again, now you'll see that I get the worst team is the Cubs. This is the workflow that I want to get into, is I make my code updates, I push them out to AWS. It's kind of a one-step process. It's almost like a click of a button, right? I hit the up arrow and hit enter and my code goes out to AWS Lambda. That's the idea. Okay, so I'm ready to make some changes. I want to access that database. Okay, but I want to use this as my build process. Okay, so the first part of this is let's get a build process together, our workflow together, so that when I make changes to my source code, that I can just automatically push them out to Lambda. But now I'm ready to go. Now I want to just work in Atom, and I want to get my code up and running against my local database. Okay, so in order to do that, I don't want kind of this index.sh. I'm going to go ahead and rename it to index.sh.save.text. So eventually I'll push it out to Blackboard. But I'm going to have a new file called index.sh. Sorry, index.js, sorry. So I have index.js, and I need a starting point, so I'm going to have to export this handler. It's going to be equal to some asynchronous function that takes an event parameter. This is our starting point. Okay, and then I want to require the AWS SDK. So I'm going to have a variable called AWS equal to require AWS SDK. So basically, I'm just saying bring in that class library. So I'm going to want to do some stuff with that class library. In order for this to run, our Lambda function right now is on US East 2. We're going to see that it's on US East 2. I have to configure this instance of AWS. So I'm going to say aws.config.update, and then this method takes one parameter, which is an object, where I specify the region being US East 2. And I talked about this a little bit in class on Tuesday. My Lambda functions are on US East 2. I'm going to have my Dynamo database on US East 2. And everything's going to run on US East 2 so that all of my AWS resources are in the same region. Okay, that's the idea. Then once I've done that, I should be able to create a DynamoDB client. This is uppercase. And since I want to run this locally before I ever get out to the server, I forgot one step. So my region is going to be US East 2, but my endpoint URL is going to be my local database, which is http://localhost 8000. Now I'm creating a database client locally. and I want to be able to query or scan. Doesn't necessarily matter because I'm running it locally. I'm not paying for any of the computing resources. I want to query my baseball stats local table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define my parameters. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to say, here's my table name, which is going to be baseball stats local. And that's all I really need to do. That's the only param I need. And I'll be honest with you, I can't remember if the endpoint URL needs to go into the params or the config. We'll find out. All right, we're going to be able to test it locally. Okay, but then once I have that, I should be able to then scan my database. So I want to say const data equal to dbclient.scan. I'm going to pass in my parameters. And I think when we initially looked at this, this is really all we had to do is we had to scan it, and then eventually we'd get our data back, and life would be good. We could return our data. But because we're running this asynchronously, what's going to happen is this scan has some lag time. So I'm saying scan the table, get the results back. The problem is there's a time lag there. And what will end up happening is I need the data right now because I'm about to return from the function. So what I really need to do is I want to say, go ahead and return this promise. Okay, and promises are kind of a more advanced topic than I want to get into, to be honest with you. I want to return that data. And basically what the promise allows me to do is it allows me to wait here. Because what's going to happen is if I don't have that promise with the await in front of it, what will happen is it says, okay, yeah, I'm going to scan the table, just keep going, return the data, which is undefined at this point. Instead, what I'm saying is, no, we can't do that. I know I said the function was asynchronous, but I really need you to pause and hang on a second while the data comes back from the database. I need you to wait here. I don't want you to go on without me. Like that's what that code is doing. Okay? And then instead of returning the data, all I'm going to do is console.log the data because we want to see it. Eventually I want to return it if I'm going to push it out to a Lambda function, but we want to see, are we getting any data? Because I'm running locally, I just want to see it on the terminal. Okay, so this is my file. I want to go over to my terminal so I can run this. The way I run it is with node, and then the file name index.js. Unexpected token export. It's exports. Okay, let me clear that. That's an easy error to fix. Why am I not seeing any output? Let's try that again. So I'm not getting any console.logs. Why am I not getting my console.logs from node? I know why. I'm an idiot. We have this function, exports.handler. We're never invoking it here. It automatically gets invoked in Lambda. So we're basically defining a function definition, right? That's what's going on here. When we test it, we invoke the function definition. All we have is the function definition. So I want to invoke that function. Okay, so it was basically saying, yeah, that function definition looks good. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Okay, so you'll see I got my message about retrieving my data, so the function's getting invoked, and then I get an unhandled promise rejection warning, resource not found, requested resource was not found. My guess is that this endpoint URL should be in the params. I had mentioned that I wasn't sure. And I'm not even sure about that syntax, so the case sensitivity is probably going to be wrong. Unexpected parameter, unexpected key found in params. For AWS SDK. Yeah. Just right here, you think it was just endpoint? Unexpected key. And do you think up in the config? Thank you. Here. I knew the hyphen looked wrong, but and eventually we end up with our data. So we end up with our data. I'm fairly happy with that, right? This is what I wanted. I wanted to be able to scan the records and get my players and objects from Dynamo. Okay, so if I skip back over to Atom, like I know that I'm going to have to change this configuration. Yeah.
And currently that was just showing the structure of the table without any populated data yet, right?
No. So if I go back over to the terminal, you'll see it's showing items. So what I got returned was an object.
Mm-hmm.
So I get an object back. It has a collection of items, and then the items are the actual records that are in that table. Okay, so maybe I decide, like, I really don't care about the whole object. Like, I don't care that there were 24 records and the scanned count was 24, because that's what's going to build me. Maybe I only care about the items. So this is JSON data. Data's an object. I can go ask just to output the items. So just output the data items. So if we run this again, now you'll notice that it's just an array of objects. Okay, so now I don't have the full scan. I have just the data that's coming from that local database. So I had pre-populated data in my local database, and that's what we're seeing is those 24 records. Okay, so I'm ready for this to get pushed out with one change, that my endpoint should not be localhost :8000. I want it to be an actual DynamoDB database. Okay. And then I also might want to change the table name. So I might have like a configuration file if I was going to change this, but for now, let's go ahead and just comment out this configuration. Then we can bring this config statement. But we know our endpoint is not going to be local. And we know that our table name, we can have it baseball stats local, but really I think the separation was when we were dealing with DynamoDB that was part of AWS, we were calling it baseball stats. And then when we were dealing with our database that's local, we were calling it baseball stats local. So I'm just going to go ahead and comment that out and call it baseball stats. And the truth is, I don't have data. I don't have a DynamoDB database that's in AWS. I didn't save it, right? So we'll fix that here in a second. Okay, and then instead of console.logging these data items, that's great that I do console.log them. We'll be able to see them on Lambda, but I really just want to return them. Like the statement here is going to be to return those data items. Okay. Okay, so then I push this out to Lambda, and I'm going to get errors. And I say I'm going to get errors because I don't have this database, this table. It doesn't exist. Okay, so I'm expecting to get errors, but they hopefully should get corrected once we create that Dynamo database. So I'm ready to push this out. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to execute that build matcdemo.sh, so it compiles into a zip file and then pushes it out. Okay, and now if I go back over to Lambda and try to test this, I told you I was going to run into errors. Right, so if I try to test this now, I'm expecting to see an error saying, hey, you don't have access to that database is what I was expecting, but I'm getting a different error. I'm getting an access denied exception. Okay, so let's kind of take this as a two-part thing. I said it was going to get fixed once I create the DynamoDB database, and that's not entirely true. There's an additional step that I forgot to mention. We're still going to have this access denied error, but let's create the Dynamo database. Okay, so if I go over to services and I go into DynamoDB, and I want to be in the same region, so I'm still in Ohio, I'm going to create a table called baseball stats. And the primary key is going to be team ID, and we'll add a sort key, which is SK. Again, this is from our sample data that we've used a couple times already. So team ID being a string, sort key being a string, I'm going to go ahead and create the table.
ID was capitalized, right?
I and D were both capitalized, yep, to match the data that we have from our data sets. Okay, and then if you remember, I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page if you're pushing this out. So if you remember, I'm going back to our Cloud for Developers class, and then under course content, we had that seed command to push those files. Do you remember these commands? Okay, so I've configured DynamoDB, or I'm sorry, I've configured AWS so that it has my public key and private key. So I'm all configured with AWS. However, I usually run on a different region. Like I usually use US East 1. So I'm going to go ahead and execute this AWS configure command. It says you have your access key. See how it has it in that square brackets? Does everyone see right now I issued the configure command and it said, what's your AWS access key ID? And it has that key in square brackets. The square brackets indicates that's the default value. So it's saying there is a configuration file out there already. We already have an access key ID. I don't want to change that. So I just hit enter and it's going to keep the default. Same with the secret key. But I do want to change my region. And it looks like I must have done it already to push out to US East 2. I think I did it when I was testing the push out to Lambda. Okay, so I'm configured okay already. So the configuration's all fine. I just want to run these batch statements. But I want to run these batch statements from the location where those files exist. Okay, so just in an effort so that I don't have to jump all over the place, I have these files right here. I'm going to open them up with Atom because I know that they say baseball stats local. I want to get rid of that. So that's Teams. I'm going to save that in my project directory. I'm going to save it into my MATC demo directory. So on my desktop in the MATC demo, I'm saving it as teams.json. And then I want to do the same thing with player.json. And I didn't save it as. So I want it going onto my desktop in the MATC demo as player.json. And then same thing for games. And the idea there would be that if I'm looking at my file system, I can see that those JSON files exist. So games.json, players.json, teams.json. Then I should be able to issue those commands that I have here. I'm just going to copy and paste them, all three at the same time. Saying I want all three of those files pushed out to DynamoDB. So all three of those commands ran. There were no unprocessed items. If I go over to Lambda now, or I'm sorry, DynamoDB, and refresh my items, you'll see I have data now. So now I'm to the point where my Lambda function should be able to pull this data out. So I loaded this database. I have my baseball stats database table. I should be able to go over to Lambda. And if I look at this function, I think the code is correct, but when I test it, it's going to fail. See how I still have the same error, that access denied exception? My Lambda code does not have access to connect to that DynamoDB table. So let's go back for a second. When I create a function, the permissions that get set up, I have an execution role, so create a new role with basic Lambda permissions. So that's what I did with my MATC demo. As I said, let's not worry about this. Let's just get a function out in Lambda. Let's create the function. Let's not worry about permissions. Well, now we're running into a problem with that. I don't need basic permissions. My Lambda function needs additional permissions. It needs permission to access DynamoDB. That's the error that I'm getting. I'm getting an access denied exception because my Lambda function does not have access to Dynamo. Okay? And it comes from this. But it's easy to fix. So, again, I'm going to take the easy way out today. So if I go down to my role, you can see I can click on that role within IAM. Everyone see that? So here's the function definition. It was uploaded from a zip file, the designer, the function, and the environment variables. And then we get to the execution role, like this little rectangle. And in here, there's a hyperlink to say, let me see the current role that that Lambda function uses in IAM. So I'm going to click on that. I head out to IAM, and you can see that I have one policy attached to that role. Excuse me. I need to add additional access. Okay, for today, I told you I'm going to take the easy way out. I'm going to attach a policy. I'm looking for a policy that's going to allow me to access DynamoDB. So I just type Dynamo in to filter the policies. And the easy way to handle this is, obviously, I don't want to do this necessarily for my application. I don't want to give full access. I probably could get by with read-only access, but if we want to create another function where we're going to insert or update or delete, I'm going to need additional access. So I'm cheating here and saying I want full access. Bad idea for security, but for testing and for development, I think it's probably fine. Okay, so I'm going to attach that policy to our existing role. So now the policy that role that's attached to our Lambda function has access to DynamoDB. Okay, so now I go over to my Lambda function, and now I want to test it. Now you'll notice it succeeded. And if I go into the details, here's our team information, and player information, and game information. This is our DynamoDB database table data. That's what I'm returning. Fair enough. What if I wanted the user to filter this based on a team or a team ID? So for instance, if I go in to configure this test event, I want to say that the team ID is teaminfo underscore LAA. I know the angels are there. Right? So you're going to send in a team ID, and I want to query the results so that it's only that particular team. Okay? So I know the event object is going to have that team ID. I can call it whatever I want. I can call it team if I want. So the key is going to be the way I want to refer to it. Like that's going to be the variable name as I refer to it. But then the right-hand side is going to be the user entered value. And I know I'm not giving you a full explanation of this. So right now we have test events where we can send that team in. Ultimately, like we'll be able to send that information in a lot of different ways, and we'll deal with that through API gateway. So like how does a user actually send that team to say I want the Angels versus the Brewers versus the Yankees versus whoever? How do they configure that? They don't configure it through these test events. They configure it by passing parameters with their web request. Okay, so like that'll end up changing. But for now, we're just going to have a team. The team's going to be attached to our event object. So if I skip back over to my source code, so I don't need the JSON files anymore. I don't need my build script. This event object is going to have a team. The way I'm going to code this, just so we can see it in development, is if event.team exists, so this is really checking if it exists, then I want to have a variable that'll have that team. For me, I'm going to teaminfo underscore LAA, and I'll overwrite it if it exists. Okay, so the way I'd read that source code is I'm saying here's a default. I want a default to the Los Angeles Angels, but if the user passes in something different, then I'll take that user entered value. Okay, that's how I'd read that code. Okay. Now our code's going to change though, right? So we're not going to do a scan anymore. We eventually want to take our data and await the data. We're going to go to our database client, and we're going to query with our parameters and get back a promise, saying eventually we're going to get back data. Right, so we're switching from a scan to a query because we want to filter this. And I'm using the wrong terminology. I shouldn't have said filter. We want to query it so that we only get the records that have that primary key. Right, so our read units that we're paying for is going to be less because we're querying it as opposed to scanning every record. Okay, so then our parameters are going to be important. So up above, where do we have our params? Right here. So our table name is going to be baseball stats. We're going to have a key condition expression. Remember this from the AWS CLI, the key condition expression? This is where it's going to show up now. So our key condition expression is going to be something like team ID is equal to some parameter t. We did this before on the AWS CLI, and we kept running into what characters have to get escaped and what characters don't get escaped, and depending on the AWS CLI. So the important thing is we're defining our expression. We're saying we want all the records where the team ID matches some parameter that we're calling T. And then we have to specify our expression attribute values. Okay, and the way we specify our expression attribute values is it has to be an object. The object that we're going to supply is this T, this variable T. It's a parameter. The parameter that we want is, oops, how did I end up there? The parameter that we want is going to be some object, right? We can't just say that our parameter T is the team ID. We have to say that it's a string that has a value that's going to match our team ID from above. Yeah.
When you had a comma on the line above that.
I do. Thank you. Okay, so with us, it's 25 records. We're not paying for much, right? So even if this is screwed up and I deployed it, not that big a deal. But let's say we have a huge data set where I have 2 million records, and if I scan it, I'm paying for 2 million read units as opposed to 24. I want to test this locally first before I push it out, right? Probably. So again, my table name goes back to baseball stats local. My config changes. So I want to be running against my local database. And then the last thing I have to do is actually invoke this function and write out the items. So the way I'm going to invoke it is I'm going to the exports handler, and I'm going to pass in an event object. So my event object is just going to be, I don't know how I keep getting my cursor moved. I'm going to pass in an object. I am actually going to pass in a team ID, or a team. So I'm going to say that the team is the team info underscore LA Dodgers. I don't even know if they exist in the data set. I think they do. We can check Dynamo. So I'm looking for this particular record. Oops. Okay, so that's what I'm passing in. Okay, so I'm ready to run this locally. So I head back out to my terminal window. I want to run node index.js. I'm getting the one record that I expected. If I want a different team, so let's say I wanted Oakland. So I just watched Moneyball. Right, so now I want to look at Oakland. I pass in a different team. Now you'll notice I get the Oakland A's. Okay, looks good to me. Right, so I want to change this back. I'm ready to push it out. So I'm returning my data items instead of logging them. I have the different configuration. And my table name is going to be baseball stats as opposed to baseball stats local. Okay, so I've made the change. I just want to run a simple query. I'm ready to push it out. So I'm going to execute that build. Why am I not seeing it? Build, because I have a typo. MATC demo. So it builds the zip file, and then it pushes out so that it's successful. Okay, now if I go back over to Lambda, my function's updated so that I'm only retrieving a single record. I can test it, and if I configure my test event right now, it's looking at the Angels. That's the default record that I'm going to get, so I don't have to change anything here. I expect to see the angels. If I look at the details, there's the one record. If I change it, so I configure it so I want the Yankees, I don't know that they exist, but I can test it. Looks like they do. If I want the Dodgers. And now I'm just paying for one read unit. So as opposed to issuing a scan that we were handling before, we were scanning everything. Our params only included the table name. Now that we're doing a query, we include the key condition expression and the expression attribute values. What if my team ID was something that was going to return more than one record? So I wanted to know the game info for the Angels. I think there's like 4 or 5 records for the Angels. So I'm saying I want all the games that the Angels participated in. Okay, so I save this, I test it, it's still going to work. I think it's still working, I just got no results back. So I can't remember what data's in there. I was expecting more results, but so it's not game info, it's just under games underscore. So I'm going to configure my test events so that it's games underscore LAA. And now if I test this, I should see all of the Angels games. And
that would be essentially what pulls previous season's calendars.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think there's a real small subset, right? Like each team's going to play 162 games. Like I think there's probably only 5 games for the Angels in here. There's not 160. And then there's some overlap because teams are playing each other. I don't know if you list the games twice, right? So this is just kind of a limited sample set of data, and the idea being that I can query that data set based on the primary key. What if I wanted to filter it? So I said, and we did this example from the CLI is why I'm bringing it up. So I have the Angels games, but then I want specific Angels games within a certain date range, right? The dates where they played, so that information's available. So if I'm looking at this data, you can see that there's a sort key that's associated with it. That sort key is the date when the game was played. So I could put that code in the key condition expression. I could say where the team ID is equal to T and the sort key is between a date range. That would be fine. Otherwise, I can specify a filter condition expression. So I could have this filter condition expression, right? Or I could just concatenate onto the key condition expression. Is there a preferred way to do it? Because regardless of how I do it, I'm going to have essentially a statement saying that the start date is this, and it's between the start date and end date, right? We don't care about the syntax. And then ultimately, I define the start date and end date in the expression attribute values. Right, so I want 2 more parameters. What's the start date? What's the end date for my date range? Does it matter whether I put that condition in the key condition expression or in the filter condition expression? If you want to pay more, there's a difference. Right? So the filter happens after I've already read my data. So I've paid to read all of the games that the Angels played in, and then I'm going to filter it based on the filter condition expression. So I paid for that read. I grabbed all of the Angels games. If I put it in the key condition expression, so I have the primary key and the sort key. So if I put the condition in the key condition expression, then I can match just the records that are going to match the key condition expression in the query. So I only pay to read the games that are going to be in matching that key condition expression. So yeah, if you're paying for it, it matters. Amazon probably wants you to put it in the filter condition expression because you're paying them more. Yeah.
So basically, if you're paying and you want to reduce costs, you're never going to use the filter condition expression.
No, I think there's a better option. So sometimes you want to filter on non-keys, right? So then you don't have a choice. But if you have a key where you're essentially doing that filter, then it belongs in the key condition expression. But again, I might want to filter where like a team has scored more than 5 runs. Runs is not part of the key. It's not the primary key. It's not the sort key. I really only have 2 options for keys, primary key and sort key. So I have other data that I care about and I want to filter based on that other data. Then I'm going to use the filter condition expression. So even though I have to pay to filter, like I had to pay to read all the records that match the key, and then I'm going to filter down those data sets, I might want to filter it down because it's faster here than it is through code. So as opposed to saying, yep, I'm going to filter it later, I'll filter it here on the query. Even though I have to pay the same amount, whether I filtered or didn't filter. It just gets me to the results that I want. Yeah?
I have a quick question about the sort key.
Yep.
So when you're looking at a website and you see a table of data displayed for whatever it is you care about, and they have a few different columns listed, is the sort key the default sorting method?
No. No, so the primary key and the sort key have to be unique. Okay, so this is kind of unlike a relational database. It's hard to talk about the architecture of these NoSQL databases without spending a ton of time on it. But the idea here is that I want one table to express my whole application. And you'll see there's 3 different types of data that they're really storing. They're storing games, they're storing players, they're storing teams. And then they're using the sort key to represent different things. And really what it allows me to do is it allows me to filter. So they chose a sort key. If I'm filtering based on games, I'm probably filtering on dates. If I'm filtering on players, I'm probably filtering on player numbers, is what they're saying. If I'm filtering on teams, I'm filtering on the abbreviation. That's why they chose that sort key. So SK is really kind of an arbitrary name, knowing that I might want to do a secondary search, and it makes that search faster and cheaper.
Oh, so it's like a second tier in the query.
It is.
Okay, that makes it a lot clearer.
That's what it is. And honestly, in this case, it represents different things. So SK, what does that represent? Well, if it's a game, it's the date. If it's a player, it's the player number. And if it's the team, it's the team abbreviation. So it doesn't even have a good column name to describe what the data is. The only reason the SK is here in this data set, and I see this all the time in NoSQL databases, is this SK, is so that I can do that secondary filter. Like it's different. You would never do this in a relational database. So I don't have a good example of saying, here's a relational database, this is how it would translate over. There is no translation to say, this is what happens in relational databases, this is what happens in NoSQL databases. This is unique to NoSQL databases. Okay, and it's all about having those efficient reads. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for today. I'll upload the video right now. I'll also upload the source code if that's helpful, so that you can get.